financial and political corruption on a huge scale. But those running the market had realised that the numbers were not telling the truth because the giant accounting firms had become corrupted.
I knew that the great accounting firms had engaged in practices that were very, very questionable and very often fraudulent. We were seeing more and more and more of these cases.
And this phenomenon is rampant across the world. Here is a lowdown on the biggest banking frauds in the world's history.
Leading banks across the world have been exposed to scams and been swindled of money.
In one of the biggest corruption scandals to hit the Philippines.
It's a scam that starts in the Philippines and stretches across the globe.
I am from Hong Kong Bank, and I believe that our bank invested more than 1 billion in stocks in the Philippines. But they could not explain what happened.
I was the one who processed it when Citibank North America invested more than 200 million worth of stocks in the Philippines.
Bank Nacional de Paris invested in stocks in the Philippines, but the money just disappeared.
Standard Chartered Bank invests more than 100 million, but got nothing in return. Is it safe then to invest in the Philippines?
سوف تضيع أموالنا لا نستطيع ثقافيهم.
And what did the Philippine government do about this? Are they really concerned about the welfare of foreign investors?
Is it really worth investing in the Philippines? They can't even resolve their problem on corruption. How can we trust them with our money?
This is a clear indication that the Philippines cannot handle the fraud cases like this, or they just simply ignore the security of foreign investors.
I'm here in the Philippines to uncover a fraud concerning foreign investors. And it involves big international banks like Citibank of North America, Standard Chartered Bank, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, Banque Nationale de Paris, OCBC Bank Singapore, just to name a few. Join me as I search for the truth behind this fraud. Here are the things we need to find out. What company is responsible for this? What's the track record of this company? Because all these big banks, international banks, trusted their money with the company. So why was that? How much investment was at stake? Who were the investors? And most important, what happened with that investment? So we've been researching, I've been reading a lot of articles from those days, and it seems that Uniwide was involved with all this mess, though we need to gather more details about the company. Uniwide was the #1 retail chain in the country during the 80s and 90s. With gross sales reaching between 15 and 20 billion pesos annually in the 90s. UHI Sales Warehouse Club reached its peak in net sales at 14.7 billion pesos in 1997. Uniwide Group employed around 30,000 people, and its transactions with suppliers were heavily based on cash. Store sizes: minimum of 1 hectare per store. Number of customers: checkout counters around 60 per store. Uniwide received 4.3 billion funding from its initial public offering, IPO, in August 1996. Now, this is very interesting, guys. You see, all these articles are saying that Uniwide was the #1 retail chain in the Philippines in the 80s and 90s. All right. Uniwide had assets for 30 billion pesos. It was a strong company, and it got an additional funding of 4.3 billion pesos. So, how come in 1 year, by 1997, it was declared bankrupt? How did that happen? It was a strong company. It had 30 billion pesos that disappeared in 1 year. What happened with the money coming in? Where did that money go? All right, guys. Yeah? We need to gather more leads and evidence to see if these articles are true or not. But for now, let me call our contact here in the Philippines. Yeah? And see you guys in a while. Ernie, what's up? I'm waiting here for our tour guide that will bring us to Makati, Cubao, Ortigas, and other places where hopefully we're gonna find some leads that will help us in our investigation. See you there, guys! I'm here at the Philippine Stock Exchange to gather some info about our subject. What's the info we have so far? That in 1996, Uniwide was listed publicly, and since then, nobody heard much about it anymore. That's a mystery, isn't it? Join me while we gather more facts about this matter. here at Cubao, where Uniwide used to be. I'm gonna ask around and ask people. I'm gonna ask people if they know about it, if they've been shopping there, if they have some news of whatever happened to the biggest supermarket in the area. How could the biggest supermarket, the most successful supermarket in the 80s, 90s, just suddenly disappear, go out of business? Mystery. Hi po. Big supermarket. Heard about it? So from what we've been asking around here in Cubao, people say it was the biggest, number one, it was the number one store chain in the 80s, 90s. This was the location for the biggest mall, the shopping center, the biggest supermarket around. But now it's nowhere to be found. No one knows what happened with it. How come? I asked myself, how come such a successful business worth billions disappeared, went out of business? Is it bad management? Is it magic? Did they do the wrong investments? What happened? After days of research, investigation, meeting up with people that could help us shed some light on our investigation, I finally got all these papers that will hopefully help us find out the truth, or at least connect the dots about what's happening with Uniwide. How I got my hands on all these papers, that's a long story. And I'll tell you that story later on. But now, let's get to know if the stories we heard about Uniwide are true or not. It's all over the net that Uniwide was the #1 store in the 80s and the 90s in the Philippines. And I have papers here that show the sales of the company from 1994 to 1999. Sales, 1994, 11,792,543,794. I give it to the peso. 1995, 12 billion 776 million 82,833 pesos. 1996, it gets better. 15 billion 20 million 645,755 pesos. 1997, similar. 14 billion 980 million 220,318 pesos. And finally, 1998, 7 billion 831 million 610,288 pesos. Based on our accounting papers, the peak years of sales of Uniwide were 1996 and 1997, both years with around 15 billion pesos in sales. That was the year of the IPO and the year it went bankrupt. The year with most sales is the year it went bankrupt. I really don't understand. I think these numbers speak of a company that's doing well in business. What do you think? Look at this. I believe these 27,000 investors, were convinced by the numbers I just gave you, and that's why they invested in the IPO of Uniwide in 1996. Banks that were included there: international banks, Citibank of North America, Standard Chartered Bank, Banque Nationale de Paris, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, OCBC Bank Singapore, Indo-Suez Bank, ING Bank, that's my bank by the way, ING Baring, Bank Luxembourg, and many more. And the investments from this IPO in 1996 brought new capital to the company of 4.3 billion pesos. If Uniwide became a public listed company in 1996, that means one thing. It means it fulfilled accurately all the requirements that the Philippine government has for a private company to be listed publicly. That's a long list of requirements with a lot of accounting checking going on, a lot of documentation going on. Therefore, I believe that the write-ups about its performance, about its sales, about its assets, was true and accurate, at that point at least. And where did the 4.3 billion pesos of its IPO go? And here we have a clear report from SGV saying that the 4.3 billion pesos were deposited in a custodian bank. All right, so now let's search online what the definition of custodian bank is. Custodian bank is a financial institution that holds customers' securities for safekeeping to prevent them from being stolen or lost. So, in this report by SGV, a very important accounting firm in the Philippines, where it specifies that the money was deposited to a custodian bank, what it doesn't specify is what bank was the custodian bank. Where did they put the money? It doesn't specify at all. So, pretty incredible. My question is, if Uniwide received 4.3 billion pesos at its peak, it had 15 billion sales, remember in 1996 and 1997. At its peak performance, they received extra funding. Where did that money go? All that money from local and international investors came in. And it just disappeared? They just went bankrupt in the strongest moment of their history? It doesn't add up. We definitely need to dig more into this. Hi, I'm investigating this fraud that happened in the Philippines during the 90s, and I believe that Hong Kong Shanghai Bank was one of the investors.
How did you know that?
I have the papers here that indicate that Hong Kong Shanghai Bank invested more than 1 billion pesos in stocks of Uniwide Holdings.
So, what do you need from me?
I would need some input from you guys on this. Sir, according to the papers I have here in my possession, your bank, Citibank of North America, invested more than 200 million pesos in stocks of Uniwide Holdings in 1996. Do you remember any of that?
During my time, I was one of them who processed the dealing with their broker.
Would you still remember the names of the people you were dealing with at that time?
Banque Nationale de Paris invested in stock in the Philippines. But they cannot explain until now where did it go.
According to the papers I have here, Standard Chartered Bank invested more than 100 million pesos in stocks of Uniwide Holdings.
We trusted them in that amount of money, hoping we can gain something out of it.
أنني أعتقد بأننا سوف نخسر أموالنا لو نستمر بالفلبين.
Please include in your investigations if the Philippine government is aware of this fraud.
What action did the Philippine government do to check? What really happened to this foreign investment in this company?
Can the Philippine government really handle this kind of cases? Or we are the least of their priorities?
Is there a way to find out what really happened?
Is it still possible to retrieve our investment?
We demand clarity and justice to this case.
We are calling the attention of Philippine government in this.
كيف يمكن القضاء على الأملاك البيل تجزئة في الأذون الآن واحد؟ هناك شيء مريب. هل كانت وظيفة الشركة عن الهدم؟
Who do we turn to for help in such a situation like this? Or do they just expect us to keep quiet?
The way I see it, it's a rip-off. We might be the victims of an orchestrated fraud.
All those questions are valid and need to be answered. And that's why we're here, to figure out what really happened. What provoked the fall of a giant #1 retailer in the Philippines in that time? As we heard that only 1 year after being listed publicly, this company went into financial quicksand, and it's a giant mystery where the money of 27,000 local and foreign investors went. I just think there's more into this than it seems. I think that this might just be the tip of the iceberg. What do you think? So stay with us as we search for truth and justice for all those who fell victim of this great ripoff.